The sky over the European theater in the summer of 1943 was a canvas of fire and shadow, a war-torn expanse where courage was measured not in medals, but in sheer survival, and where the faintest whiff of smoke could be the last scent a pilot ever remembered. And amid this chaos soared a figure whose story would defy the very limits of imagination. For this was not a tale of conventional warfare, not a story of bullets and cannons that tore through the clouds, but of a man whose skill, audacity, and split-second decision-making would allow him to face an enemy squadron head-on with no guns at his disposal, and yet emerge victorious, a feat that would confound generals, historians, and fellow aviators alike, because as he climbed into the cockpit of his battered, nearly obsolete fighter plane, the engine humming and the metal vibrating beneath him, he understood that the odds were not merely against him, they were almost laughably stacked. For the Luftwaffe unit he would face that day was well-armed, experienced, and ruthless, and they would not hesitate to shred him from the sky at the first sign of weakness. Yet in that moment, with the sun glinting off his canopy and a thin trail of exhaust marking his ascent into a seemingly endless azure battlefield, he felt a strange clarity, focus honed by countless hours of training and the silent prayers of those who awaited his return, because he knew that conventional thinking would not save him, that brute firepower would not decide the outcome, and that every maneuver, every twitch of the stick, every subtle adjustment in throttle could be the difference between survival and obliteration. And as the first enemy fighters appeared on the horizon, silhouetted against the blazing sun, circling like hawks, their wings gleaming with lethal intent, the tension was palpable, almost suffocating. And yet he remembered the stories whispered among pilots, legends of those who had flown beyond the ordinary limits of skill and survived through ingenuity alone, and he resolved to become one of those legends, to exploit every quirk of aerodynamics, every flaw in the enemy's formation, and every moment of hesitation that fear might induce in even the most seasoned adversary. Because this would not be a battle fought with bullets, but with mind, reflexes, and daring. A high-stakes chess game in 3 dimensions, where the stakes were his life and the lives of those who depended on him returning. And as he initiated the first evasive maneuver, diving sharply to avoid a direct pass from an enemy Messerschmitt, the sheer audacity of his approach began to register, a calculated risk that would leave historians scratching their heads for decades, as he began to engage in what could only be described as aerial improvisation, weaving through clouds, banking sharply, rolling, inverting, using gravity and momentum to make himself a difficult target, all while psychologically manipulating the enemy into believing he had more firepower than he did, creating illusions of presence, feints, and traps, luring them into errors that he would exploit. And as each second ticked by, the tension ratcheted higher. The sky filled with the roar of engines and the invisible sting of bullets narrowly missing. Yet he remained unscathed, and it was here, in this extraordinary ballet of speed, danger, and split-second decision-making, that he would perform maneuvers so audacious and unexpected that even veteran enemy pilots would be forced to break formation, retreat, or crash, illustrating that in the art of aerial combat, courage, creativity, and nerve could outweigh firepower. And as the engagement continued, the pilot began a sequence of moves that seemed to defy physics itself, using divan climb tactics, energy management, and deceptive flight paths to isolate each enemy aircraft, forcing them to make critical mistakes. And with each successful evasion, his confidence and control grew, turning what seemed like near-certain death into a strategic masterpiece, demonstrating not only the incredible skill required to survive such encounters, but also the profound psychological aspects of warfare, the manipulation of perception and anticipation of enemy behavior, the subtle exploitation of panic, and the audacious decision to trust instinct over instruments or standard procedures. And as the final minutes of the dogfight approached, the sheer drama of the encounter reached its zenith, with the pilot maneuvering into positions so unlikely that any observer would have thought as plain moments from destruction, yet through sheer calculation, nerve, and improvisational genius, He executed a final move that neutralized the remaining opposition without firing a single shot, a feat that would leave commanding officers stunned and historians debating for decades how such a victory could have been achieved, illustrating a profound truth about warfare, about courage, and about the human spirit. That even in the absence of conventional weaponry, ingenuity and audacity could rewrite the rules of combat. And as he finally pulled away from the last enemy aircraft, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins, the enormity of what he had accomplished began to settle in, a mixture of disbelief, triumph, and exhaustion, marking the beginning of a legend that would echo through the annals of World War II aviation history, forever reminding all who heard it that sometimes victory is not about the guns you carry, but the mind and heart with which you wield them. A story that would captivate audiences, inspire generations, and defy conventional understanding, ensuring that this extraordinary pilot's daring dogfight without guns would be remembered not merely as an episode of chance, but as a testament to the boundless limits of human skill, courage, and audacity in the face of overwhelming odds. A story whose suspense and drama could fill the hearts of viewers as they imagined themselves in the cockpit, feeling the roar of engines, the tension of imminent danger, and the ultimate exhilaration of defying death through sheer ingenuity, leaving them on the edge of their seats, waiting, wondering, and utterly captivated, as the echo of engines and the distant roar of artillery faded into a tense backdrop. The pilot, still gripping the controls with white-knuckled intensity, knew that surviving the initial engagement was only the beginning, that the Luftwaffe would regroup, and that this was a war not just of bullets but of relentless mental pressure, split-second decisions, and the constant weighing of risk against reward. And so, he began to anticipate the enemy's next move, watching the clouds like a hawk, reading every shift in light, every hint of turbulence, every subtle change in formation, understanding that in this deadly game, observation could be as lethal as firepower. And with each passing second, the psychological warfare intensified, as he imagined the minds of his adversaries. Seasoned pilots who had been trained to exploit any weakness, yet now found themselves manipulated by someone whose only weapon was audacity, skill, and a seemingly preternatural grasp of spatial dynamics. And as he executed a rapid series of dives and ascents, banking sharply to evade an oncoming attack, he began to notice patterns in their behavior. The slight hesitation before a turn, the momentary adjustment in throttle, tiny signs that indicated overconfidence, fatigue, or even fear. And he began to exploit these, calculating trajectories, speeds, and energy states in real time, turning his lack of weaponry into an advantage. A form of asymmetric combat where the enemy's strength became their vulnerability, and as the skirmish progressed, he implemented daring maneuvers that blurred the line between instinct and calculation, weaving in and out of cloud banks, appearing to vanish only to re-emerge behind enemy lines, forcing enemy pilots into defensive positions, disrupting their formations, and creating opportunities to isolate them from their comrades. Each move meticulously crafted to minimize his exposure while maximizing the psychological pressure on his foes. And all the while, he remained acutely aware of the fragility of his situation. The slightest miscalculation, a fraction of a second too slow, could result in a fatal collision, a loss of control, or a catastrophic engine failure. Yet he pressed on, driven by the knowledge that every second he survived brought him closer to turning the impossible into reality. And as he pushed the aircraft to its mechanical limits, the airframe groaning under the strain, the engine protesting with every increase in RPM, he began to notice the subtle ways the enemy was reacting. The first sign of fear manifesting as tighter formations, erratic banking, misjudged climbs, and the smallest hesitation. All signals that he used to manipulate their movements further, herding them like predators into traps that existed only in his mind, but which became real through flawless execution. And with a combination of barrel rolls, sudden dives, and deceptive approaches, he created the illusion of an armed threat, a phantom firepower that forced enemy pilots to miscalculate, miss opportunities, and ultimately expose themselves. And as he watched one enemy plane falter, the realization of his tactical genius began to crystallize, a sense of control amidst chaos. A demonstration of how intellect, nerve, and acute situational awareness could outperform the brute force of weaponry. And yet, the pilot was not merely surviving. He was transforming the engagement into a psychological duel, turning fear into a weapon, anticipation into strategy, and every instinct honed by countless flight hours into a decisive advantage. And as he navigated through treacherous weather pockets, clouds thick with moisture and turbulence, he used the environment itself as a shield and a tool, diving into obscurity only to emerge behind his pursuers, forcing them into disarray and further feeding their confusion, all while managing fuel consumption, engine temperature, and structural stress with an almost surgical precision. And the intensity of the moment escalated as the dogfight reached a fever pitch. Planes spinning in complex aerial choreography, engines screaming, the wind tearing at metal and fabric alike. And yet he maintained perfect control, executing maneuvers that even experienced instructors would call reckless if performed under normal circumstances, but which, in his hands, became instruments of survival and domination. And as the final stretch of the engagement approached, with enemy numbers dwindling due to his strategic manipulations and their own errors, he set up the concluding phase. A series of moves so audacious that they would later be dissected by historians and aviation experts, analyzed in manuals and recounted in the hushed tones of awe that only true mastery inspires. And in this final sequence, he leveraged gravity, airspeed, and precise timing to place himself in positions where the enemy could neither anticipate nor react effectively, forcing them into a position of surrender without a single shot fired, a testament to the power of intellect, courage, and the audacity to challenge convention. And as the last enemy plane veered away, retreating from what they perceived as a more dangerous opponent than they had ever encountered, the pilot finally allowed himself a fleeting exhale, the adrenaline still coursing through him, his heart racing, yet a profound sense of accomplishment settling in. Because in that moment, he had not only survived, but he had rewritten the rules of engagement, turned fear into leverage, skill into weaponry, and improvisation into victory. And as he charted a course back to base, the clouds parting to reveal the sun dipping low on the horizon, he reflected on the extraordinary sequence of events, understanding that what he had achieved was not just a personal triumph, but a lesson in the limitless potential of human ingenuity, courage, and determination in the face of overwhelming odds. And as the memory of enemy planes spinning, diving, and retreating lingered, he knew that the story of this remarkable dogfight would endure, capturing imaginations and inspiring countless aviators. For it demonstrated that even without conventional tools, mastery of mind, body, and aircraft could transform desperation into strategy, fear into opportunity, and a seemingly impossible situation into an astonishing, unforgettable victory. As the pilot soared higher into the thinning air, the horizon stretching endlessly before him, he felt the immense weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, knowing that each maneuver, each decision, was a delicate balance between survival and catastrophe. And yet in that crucible of tension, a remarkable clarity emerged, a mental sharpness that allowed him to perceive the battlefield with unprecedented depth, noticing subtle shifts in enemy formation, tiny glimmers of sunlight reflecting off metallic surfaces, the faint trails of disturbed air revealing approach angles and velocity. And it was here, in the unforgiving expanse of the sky, that he began to exploit every principle of aerodynamics, turning physics itself into an ally, banking at precise angles, climbing and diving with careful attention to energy retention, utilizing gravity and momentum as weapons. And as he executed a series of near-impossible rolls and dives, he watched the enemy respond, their reactions delayed, misjudged, or outright wrong. And in those moments, he seized control of the encounter, demonstrating that in aerial combat, intuition informed by experience could be as deadly as any machine gun. And as the dogfight unfolded, It became clear that this was more than a test of reflexes or courage. It was a battle of wits. A three-dimensional chess match in which each opponent sought to outthink, outmaneuver, and dominate the other. And yet the pilot, unarmed yet unyielding, began to orchestrate maneuvers so audacious that even the most seasoned enemy aviators hesitated, their confidence shaken by the unpredictable, seemingly impossible tactics he employed. Leveraging every element of the environment, the sun blinding, the clouds concealing, the wind buffeting to manipulate perception, create illusions of greater firepower, and induce errors that would tip the scales of survival. And as he twisted, turned, and inverted his aircraft, the sheer audacity of his approach began to sow confusion, forcing enemy pilots to second-guess, to miscalculate, and ultimately to expose vulnerabilities that he could exploit with surgical precision. And all the while, the mental strain was immense. Every second, a test of endurance, focus, and nerve. As the physical demands of extreme maneuvers pushed the limits of his body and machine alike, yet he adapted, drawing on muscle memory, instinct, and an uncanny ability to anticipate enemy actions. Reading subtle cues in posture, throttle adjustments, and wing position to predict trajectories. And in this extraordinary display of skill, he began to isolate opponents one by one, exploiting formation weaknesses and orchestrating a scenario in which each enemy plane was maneuvered into a position of disadvantage without a single shot being fired, demonstrating that victory could be won through strategy, audacity, and psychological mastery rather than brute force. And as he dove through a dense bank of clouds, disappearing from view only to re-emerge behind a bewildered adversary, the complexity of his improvisation became apparent. A breathtaking combination of timing, spatial awareness, and relentless focus that blurred the line between human capability and instinctive genius. And as the enemy attempted to regroup, he anticipated their movements, countering every approach, using counterintuitive tactics that exploited their expectations, turning their training against them, and as the minutes stretched on, each maneuver escalating in danger and precision, the sky became a stage for a symphony of chaos orchestrated by a single, fearless pilot, whose vision and nerve allowed him to dominate the engagement despite the absence of conventional weaponry. And as the skirmish reached a critical juncture, he executed a sequence of dives and climbs so perfectly timed that the remaining enemy pilots were trapped in positions from which recovery was nearly impossible, their attempts to escape thwarted by their own misjudgments. And it was in this moment that the true brilliance of his approach revealed itself, demonstrating the power of creativity under pressure, the profound impact of anticipation, and the extraordinary effectiveness of psychological leverage in combat. And as the adrenaline surged, his mind operating at peak performance, he manipulated each motion with deliberate intent, turning chaos into opportunity, risk into advantage, and fear into a tool, forcing the enemy to abandon aggression, retreat, or crash into one another. And in these extraordinary moments, he exemplified the principle that sometimes the most formidable weapon is not a machine gun or cannon, but the mind capable of understanding, predicting, and exploiting every variable. And as the final enemy aircraft faltered, the consequences of his meticulous strategy became clear, leaving him not just alive, but in a position of dominance, having turned a hopeless scenario into a textbook example of ingenuity, courage, and mastery of the battlefield. And as he leveled off, breathing heavily, sweat and tension marking his face, the enormity of what he had accomplished began to settle in, a combination of relief, astonishment, and satisfaction. For he had survived, succeeded, and redefined the parameters of what was possible in aerial combat. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the tattered landscape below, he realized that his daring, improvisational approach had created not only a victory but a legend, a story that would captivate, educate, and inspire generations, demonstrating that even in the absence of traditional weaponry, the combination of courage, creativity, skill, and relentless determination could overcome any obstacle. And as he traced a careful path back toward base, reflecting on the sequence of maneuvers, the calculated risks, and the moments of near disaster turned triumph. He understood that what he had achieved was more than a tactical victory. It was an enduring testament to human ingenuity, bravery, and the extraordinary potential to defy expectations and rewrite the rules of engagement, leaving all who would hear the story enthralled by the remarkable tale of a pilot who fought a dogfight with no guns and yet emerged victorious. A story whose suspense, drama, and mastery would keep viewers riveted, imagining themselves in the cockpit, heart pounding, eyes scanning the sky, and adrenaline coursing, fully immersed in the breathtaking, high-stakes reality of life-and-death aerial combat. As the pilot banked sharply over the rolling cloudscape, the adrenaline coursing through his veins heightened every sense, every sound. Every vibration of his aircraft amplified into a symphony of danger. For he understood that in this deadly aerial ballet, survival depended not only on skill and instinct, but on an almost preternatural awareness of both his own capabilities and those of his adversaries. And as the enemy regrouped below, forming tighter formations in an effort to regain the advantage, he recognized that conventional tactics would no longer suffice, that this engagement demanded creativity and improvisation at the limits of human capability. And so he began to implement a series of maneuvers that would later be dissected and analyzed by aviation experts. A complex interplay of dives, climbs, rolls, and energy management that transformed the sky into a three-dimensional chessboard. Each move calculated not merely to evade, but to psychologically destabilize the enemy, forcing them into hesitation, error, and ultimately self-defeat. And as he executed a daring inverted dive through a thick bank of clouds, reappearing behind an unsuspecting adversary, he marveled at how the combination of speed, timing, and misdirection could create the illusion of armament and numerical superiority. A psychological weapon as lethal as any machine gun. And with each successive maneuver, he isolated enemy aircraft one by one, exploiting overconfidence, fatigue, and instinctual reactions, turning the very experience and skill of his opponents against them. And all the while, he had to monitor every technical detail of his aircraft in temperature, structural stress, fuel levels, and aerodynamic stability, balancing risk with necessity. Aware that the smallest error could result in catastrophic failure, yet he remained in perfect control. A testament to countless hours of training, intuition honed under pressure, and a relentless focus that blurred the lines between human and machine. And as he twisted through a series of impossibly tight turns, diving and climbing with acute awareness of relative motion, he noticed a subtle pattern in the enemy's formation, a tiny delay in reaction, a microsecond of indecision which he immediately exploited, maneuvering into a position that left the opposing pilot no viable options, demonstrating that even in the absence of traditional firepower, situational awareness, anticipation, and decisiveness could dictate the outcome of a life-or-death confrontation. And as the skirmish intensified, he orchestrated a series of bait-and-trap sequences, feigning vulnerability to lure enemy pilots into fatal mistakes, all the while maintaining a mental map of every aircraft in the vicinity, calculating trajectories, speeds, energy states, and environmental factors with astonishing precision, a feat that required extraordinary cognitive stamina, unwavering focus, and nerve. And as the engagement reached its apex, the sky became a chaotic theater of movement, with enemy aircraft spiraling, banking, diving, and rolling in desperate attempts to regain control, while the pilot, unarmed but undaunted, orchestrated each motion with strategic brilliance, manipulating gravity, momentum, and perception, and exploiting the enemy's own assumptions and training. And yet, despite the complexity, danger, and relentless pressure, he maintained composure, trusting both his skill and intuition, understanding that hesitation, even for a fraction of a second, could prove fatal. And as he executed a series of high-speed maneuvers that defied conventional expectations, forcing enemy planes into collision courses with one another or into positions where recovery was impossible, He effectively neutralized the opposition without firing a single shot, a feat that would be studied, marveled at, and recounted by aviators and historians for decades. A demonstration of how ingenuity, audacity, and psychological mastery could outweigh firepower, training, and numerical advantage. And as the sun dipped closer to the horizon, casting long shadows across the turbulent battlefield, he felt the immense weight of what he had accomplished, a mixture of exhaustion, exhilaration, and profound realization that he had turned a near-impossible situation into an extraordinary victory. And as he leveled his aircraft and prepared for the journey back to base, he reflected on the sequence of maneuvers, the risks calculated, the errors anticipated and exploited, and the astonishing interplay of skill, instinct, and daring that had allowed him to dominate the engagement. Fully comprehending that the story of this unarmed pilot who defeated a well-armed enemy squadron would endure as a timeless example of human ingenuity, courage, and the capacity to transcend conventional limitations. A tale whose suspense, drama, and high-stakes tension would keep viewers enthralled, imagining the roar of engines, the heart-pounding danger, and the breathtaking mastery of aerial combat, leaving them captivated, inspired, and utterly immersed in the story of one man who turned skill, audacity, and intelligence into a weapon more powerful than any gun. As the pilot pressed onward through the cloud-swirled skies, fatigue gnawing at his muscles and the relentless roar of the engine echoing in his ears, he understood with crystal clarity that the most critical phase of this unprecedented engagement was unfolding, that every decision in the next minutes could mean survival or annihilation. And yet in this crucible of danger, he experienced a remarkable synthesis of skill, instinct, and psychological insight, a clarity born of countless hours of flight training, simulated maneuvers, and sheer necessity, allowing him to anticipate not only the movements of enemy aircraft, but the subtle mental patterns that guided their decisions. And as the Luftwaffe pilots adjusted their formations, attempting to anticipate his unpredictable maneuvers, he perceived the faintest hesitation in their approach, a microsecond's delay, a fractional misalignment, which he immediately exploited, turning each enemy advantage into a liability. And as he executed a series of audacious dives, rolls, and climbing spirals, the very air seemed to conspire with him, turbulence and updrafts aiding his precision timing, allowing him to emerge from cloud cover behind a pursuing fighter that had assumed he was vulnerable, and with a deft combination of throttle control, banking, and gravitational acceleration, he forced the adversary into a position where further engagement would result in either collision with another aircraft, loss of control, or retreat. And as he continued to manipulate the environment, using sunlight glare, cloud shadows, and deceptive angles to create illusions of firepower and proximity, the enemy pilot's confidence eroded, their initial aggression replaced with hesitation, confusion, and panic. And every instinct honed over years of combat training now worked against them, a testament to the transformative power of human ingenuity, audacity, and precise observation. And as he spiraled through one particularly tight maneuver, narrowly avoiding structural stress limits of his aircraft, he realized that the battle had become as much a mental contest as a physical one. For he had created a situation where fear, anticipation, and misperception dictated enemy behavior more than any cannon, machine gun, or ammunition. And as the remaining opposition attempted desperate flanking maneuvers, he anticipated each trajectory with uncanny accuracy, countering with maneuvers that seemed almost preternatural, using energy management, instantaneous calculations of relative motion, and deception to force them into positions of disadvantage. One by one, neutralizing threats, not by violence, but by superior cognition and audacity. And yet the stakes remained existentially high. Every maneuver a balance between mechanical tolerance, human endurance, and environmental variability. For the slightest miscalculation could produce catastrophic failure. Yet he pressed forward, fully committed to transforming the impossible into the achievable. And as the engagement reached its penultimate phase, the intensity of aerial combat escalated to a level that bordered on the surreal. enemy aircraft spinning, banking, and diving in chaotic desperation. While he executed a sequence of maneuvers that would later be analyzed in flight academies as textbook examples of psychological and tactical mastery, each move designed to destabilize, isolate, and ultimately incapacitate the opposition without the discharge of a single bullet. And as the sky roared with engines, clouds billowed like smoke from distant battlefields, and sunlight fractured across metallic fuselages, he orchestrated a final series of feints and reversals, forcing the last enemy pilot into a retreat so complete it seemed choreographed, a victory of intellect and nerve over conventional weaponry. And as the dust storm, the aerial equivalent of chaos settled, he found himself alone in a vast expanse of sky. Exhausted but exhilarated, his aircraft battered yet functional, a living testament to the extraordinary capabilities of human skill, perception, and daring. And in that quiet moment between life-threatening maneuvers and triumphant relief, he reflected on the audacity required to survive, to dominate, and to turn an unarmed situation into an overwhelming victory. Knowing that the story of this unarmed dogfight would endure for generations, inspiring awe, study, and reverence. For it had illustrated a profound principle of warfare and human potential, that intelligence, courage, ingenuity, and composure,
under extreme pressure, can outweigh traditional armament, numerical superiority, and conventional tactics. And as he charted a careful path back toward his home base, the adrenaline still coursing, heart racing, and eyes scanning for any remaining threats, he realized that every twist, dive, and calculated risk had culminated in a demonstration of mastery and bravery that few could comprehend, a narrative of survival, strategy, and supreme aerial acumen. And the suspense of the engagement lingered like a shadow, the memory of near misses, precise maneuvers, and psychological dominance etched indelibly in his mind. And as he descended toward friendly territory, the realization of what he had achieved solidified, a story that would captivate audiences, enthrall historians, and inspire future generations, a narrative whose tension, drama, and extraordinary demonstration of human capability would ensure that viewers remained riveted, imagining themselves in the cockpit, feeling the rush of air, the roar of engines, the constant threat of annihilation, and the triumphant mastery of a pilot who had defied every expectation, navigated every danger, and emerged victorious without a single shot fired, a testament to ingenuity, courage, and the boundless potential of human skill under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long, dramatic shadows across the torn and smoke-laden skies, and in that fleeting moment, as the pilot climbed above the remaining clouds, a sense of anticipation unlike any other gripped him, for he knew that this final stretch of the engagement would define not just the outcome of the battle, but the very legend of his extraordinary skill and daring. And with a sharp inhale, he tightened his grip on the control stick, feeling the vibrations of the aircraft pulse through his arms and chest, the engine roaring like a living entity beneath him. And it was in this suspended instant that he realized the enemy would attempt one last desperate maneuver, their determination as deadly as their lack of preparation was fatal, and he had only moments to act, his mind calculating, instinct reacting, and heart hammering in perfect synchrony. And as the first enemy plane lunged from beneath a dense cloud bank, appearing like a predator from the shadows, he executed a rapid inversion, barrel roll and dive, exploiting gravity, wind shear, and the element of surprise to emerge behind his adversary in a position so improbable it seemed choreographed by fate itself. And in that split second, the delicate balance of life and death, skill and chance, hung in the air, almost tangible as the enemy pilot overcompensated, banking too sharply and exposing himself to a tactical trap that required no bullets, no guns, no conventional armament, merely the supreme application of instinct, timing, and psychological mastery. And as the maneuver unfolded, the pilot orchestrated a sequence so complex and daring that it would later be analyzed in flight schools, military manuals, and historical retrospectives as a tour de force of unarmed aerial combat, a demonstration of how intellect, audacity, and anticipation could overcome superior firepower, experience, and numerical advantage. And as each second ticked by, the tension escalated, the sky itself seeming to contract with the pressure, clouds swirling like smoke from invisible battles below, the horizon a shifting mosaic of shadow and sunlight. And yet he maintained perfect control, twisting, banking, and spiraling with precision that defied conventional expectations, exploiting every quirk of the aircraft, every subtle atmospheric effect, every lapse in the enemy's perception. And as the final enemy plane floundered in confusion, overcorrecting and losing energy, he executed a series of maneuvers so perfectly timed that escape became impossible, forcing a retreat, a surrender, or catastrophic miscalculation. And in that instant, the impossible became reality, the unarmed pilot having achieved what no one thought possible, demonstrating that courage, ingenuity, and relentless focus could triumph over seemingly insurmountable odds. And yet, even as he leveled his aircraft and prepared to return to base, the intensity of the moment lingered, the adrenaline coursing, the memory of near misses, strategic deception, and unparalleled skill etched indelibly into his mind. And as he glanced over the vast expanse of sky, now quiet save for the echoing hum of his engine, he reflected on the extraordinary series of events that had unfolded, understanding that every twist, every roll, every daring maneuver had contributed to an outcome that would be celebrated, studied, and revered for decades to come. And as he descended toward the safety of friendly territory, the culmination of his efforts became a living testament to the human spirit, the potential for audacity to overcome conventional limitations, and the enduring power of skill, intelligence, and nerve. And as the base came into view, smoke rising faintly from distant fields, fellow pilots and ground crew anticipating his return, he allowed himself a fleeting moment of satisfaction, knowing that he had not only survived but had rewritten the rules of engagement, turning a seemingly hopeless scenario into an extraordinary victory. And as the final seconds of daylight faded into the evening sky, casting a golden glow over the battered landscape, the suspense of the dogfight gave way to triumph. The story of a pilot who fought a dogfight with no guns and emerged victorious forever cemented in history, a narrative of suspense, ingenuity, and courage that would enthrall viewers, hold them at the edge of their seats, and inspire awe at the extraordinary capabilities of a single human mind and spirit when pushed to the limits, leaving them captivated, imagining the roar of engines, the thrill of near-certain danger, and the breathtaking mastery that had turned fear into a weapon and improvisation into triumph. A story whose tension, drama, and unforgettable climax would ensure they remained riveted until the very last moment, fully immersed in the legend of a pilot who defied all odds and claimed victory without firing a single shot.